Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Michaela Vrazdova-Roumester, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time and talk about E-2 visa cases, and more specifically, we are going to talk about cases where the E-2 investment amount is on the lower side and some E-2 visa risky cases. A few housekeeping items before we get started. So some of you may know that the firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E-2 visa and has been in the US on several different visas, including the F1, TN, B, and H-1B visas. And as such, we know what you are going through. The firm is a full-service immigration law firm, and we do offer immigration services in a number of different areas, including E-2, E-1, TN, L-1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB-5 green cards, extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visa cases globally, and we typically process E-2 visa cases that are higher risk, and that means where the investment amount is on the lower side. As I said, we have processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are the US consulate in Toronto and the US consulate in London. We'll continue to have this webinar series, and we'll do at least 2 webinars a week on different immigration topics. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you out some useful tools. So we'll send you the PowerPoint we'll be using today during the webinar. We'll also send you a link where you can download guides that go through the visa options in more detail. We'll also send you a link where you can sign up for additional webinars we'll have in the future. This webinar will also be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll send you the link for the YouTube channel. And we encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we often post new immigration videos. Finally, we'll send you a link where you can set up a consultation with one of our experienced attorneys. So regarding speakers, today we are lucky to have Kelly LeGrand Weiner, who is a partner at Scott Legal PC, and Kelly has a vast experience processing E-2 visas at consulates around the world. As I said, my name is Michaela Vrazdova-Roumester, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Finally, for any question you have, please feel free to put the question in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we will get to all questions at the end. Perfect. So why don't we get started? So what are the E-2 visa requirements? So the first requirement is that you must be a national of one of the E-2 visa treaty countries. So there are over 80 E-2 visa treaty countries, and there are many countries from Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, Middle East, North America that are E-2 visa treaty countries. What matters here is your country of nationality and not your country of birth. So let's say, for example, that you were born in China. China is not an E-2 visa treaty country, but let's say that you also have a citizenship of for example, the United Kingdom, which is an E-2 visa treaty country. You could still apply for the E-2 visa using the UK passport. So what matters is whether you have a passport of the E-2 visa treaty country. The next requirement is that you must own at least 50% in the E-2 company. So for E-2, there generally has to be an entity set up in the US. Generally it's an LLC or a corporation, and you must own at least 50% in that company. And that requirement has to be met at the time you apply for the E-2 visa, but you have to always keep the ownership of the company at least 50%. So even after the E-2 visa is issued and once you are in the US, you always have to own at least 50% in the company. The next requirement is that you must make a substantial investment in the E-2 company. and the funds you will be investing must be at risk. So what this means is that the money has to be actually spent. So for an E2, it's not going to be sufficient if you, let's say that you transfer the money from your personal account to the company's, to the E2 company's bank account, and you have $100,000 on the E2 company's bank account, and you are saying that you are going to spend all this money after you come to the US, after the E2 visa is granted and after you come to the US. So this is not going to work for the E2. So for the E2, the government wants to see that the investment has already been made at the time you are applying for an E2 visa. So if you're applying at a consulate, you would be submitting an application. And in that application, you will have to explain, kind of like what was the investment, how you spend the money. And so basically the money already had to be spent, at the time you are applying for an E2 visa. And so this means that the funds are placed at risk. You will also have to explain the source of the E2 investment funds. So the E2 investment can come from any legitimate source. So, it can come, let's say that you have been employed in your home country for several years, and you saved money from that employment. That can be a source of funds for the E2 investment. And the government will always want to see some sort of evidence kind of explaining, kind of confirming the source of funds. So like, let's say that the money is coming from your personal savings from employment. In that case, you would have to submit your personal tax returns, just kind of generally for like the past 3 years, just kind of showing that, yes, you had this employment and this was your income in the past, past three or so years. The E2 investment funds can also come, let's say, from a gift. So the gift can come, for example, from your, friends or family members or from anyone. It can, in this case, you would have to submit a gift letter, from the person who is gifting you the money. And you would also have to submit some documents, just kind of, again, explaining, like how the person who is gifting you the money, how they got the funds. So let's say that your, grandmother is gifting you $100,000 and your grandmother sold property in her home country and the money comes from that sale. In that case, you would have to submit purchase sale agreement for the sale of the property, then her bank statement showing receipt of the funds, and then a gift letter from her to you. As I said, sometimes the source of the funds is sale of a house or a property, so that's also completely fine. And the money can also come from a loan. So the loan can either be institutional, so you can, for example, get a loan from a bank, or you can also get a loan from, a friend. That is also fine. The loan can either be secured or unsecured. If it's secured, it can be secured by, basically anything, like, for example, your real estate property in your home country or your other personal property. The only kind of caveat for loans is that the loan cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 company. So that's kind of like the only type of loan that would not work for the E2 visa. So how much money you have to invest in the E2 business? So we are going to discuss this more on the next slide, and this is called the substantiality of the E2 investment, but we are going to discuss it on the next slide. So what are some typical E2 visa expenditures? So that would be, for example, inventory. So like, let's say that you are starting an online store, you are selling something online. Any inventory you purchase can be included as part of the E2 visa investment. Then any equipment you purchase can be included. So for example, if you need, computers, scanners, printers, furniture to set up your office, all of that can be included. Any money you pay for like a website setup or marketing, all of that can be including. Office supplies can be included. Also, any money you kind of prepay for office rent can be included. If you are selling something and you need a warehouse space, also any kind of rent you pay for the warehouse can be included as part of the investment. And as I said, any money you pay for marketing can be included, and also the money you pay for a business entity setup. Perfect. So the next E-2 visa requirement is that the E-2 business cannot be marginal. So what this means is that the E-2 company has to have either present or future capacity to be able to hire US employees. So what does this mean? So for an E-2 visa, it's not required that you have employees at the time you submit the E-2 visa application. But you must be able to demonstrate in the application by, generally this is done by submitting a business plan, that the company will be able to hire you as employees in the next 5 years. So there is kind of no minimum number of employees you have to hire in the regulations, but from our experience, kind of the minimum amount of employees you would want to have by year 5 are 3 full-time employees. So this is really important, like when you are kind of considering what type of business to start or what kind of business to purchase, is to kind of think about, like will this business be able to hire at least and have at least 3 full-time employees by year 5 of operations. The next requirement is that the E-2 business must be real and operating. So the E-2 business must either already be taking revenue and earning revenue, like selling goods or servicing clients at the time you apply. Or if you are starting a new business, you will have to kind of demonstrate in the application that the E-2 business will start operating, right after you come to the US on the E-2 visa. So let's say, for example, that you purchase an already existing business in the US, and like how do you demonstrate and how do you show that you meet the real and operating requirements? So in that case, if the business is already operating, you would be submitting things like the company's tax returns, the company's profit and loss statement for the current calendar year, showing that the company is earning revenue. You would also be submitting evidence that the company has employees. So it would be things like the company's W-2s for the past years, and then the company's pay stubs for the calendar year. You could also submit things like invoices, some recent invoices the company issued to clients, or just kind of current contracts the company has with clients. Now, what do you submit in case when you are starting a new company in the US? And this is kind of, what happens a lot, that, the E-2 investor just kind of wants to start his or her own company in the US, and the company is a pure startup, hasn't started taking revenue yet and doesn't have any employee yet. So how do you demonstrate that you still meet the real and operating requirement? So in this case, you would be submitting things like evidence that you signed commercial lease in the US, evidence that you establish a business entity in the US, evidence that you already have a website, you already have marketing materials, evidence that you either have contracts with clients or letters of intent with potential clients. And also, if the type of business you are starting needs any sort of license, that you could also submit that, showing that you have the license and the business is ready to start. And as soon as you come to the US on the E-2 visa, the business will start operating. So the next requirement is that you will have to solely develop and direct the E-2 business. So this basically means that you as the E-2 investor have to have an active role in the operations of the E-2 company. So if your plan, for example, is to kind of purchase a business in the US and get the E-2 investor visa and just come to the US and retire, or just kind of don't work anymore, like that would not work for the E-2 visa. So for E-2, you will have to show that you will have a certain executive or kind of managerial role in the operations of the E-2 company. And again, like as we mentioned already, you will have to show that you own at least 50% in the E-2 company. The next requirement is that you have to have intent to return to your home country when your E-2 visa is expired. So this, generally this requirement is met simply by submitting a signed declaration by you that says, like once my E-2 visa expires, I have intent to return to my home country. And generally for this requirement, that's the only type of evidence, the government wants to see. And as I mentioned briefly already, for the E-2, you can either start your own business or you can purchase an already existing business in the US. So both are completely viable options. For the purchase of the business, there is an option to structure the transaction. So the purchase price goes through an escrow agent. So how does this work? So when you're purchasing a business, there are basically two ways how you can, transfer the purchase price to the seller. So the first option would be that, you sign a purchase sale agreement and, you transfer the purchase price to the seller. The seller receives it, and then, after that, you apply for an E-2 visa. Now, if the visa is approved, you can come to the US, manage the business. If the visa is denied, you still already signed a binding purchase sale transaction. You already transferred the money to the seller. So you will still own this business, and there is really kind of, no way for you to get out of the transaction. So the second way, how you could structure the transaction is to transfer the funds to an escrow agent. So in this case, you and the seller and the escrow agent would be signing a separate escrow agreement. And the escrow agreement would basically have to say that, all of the conditions, all of the contingencies to the purchase sale transactions have been met. And the only contingency left is the approval of your E-2 visa. So how this would work is that, you would still sign a purchase sale agreement, you would sign an escrow agreement, and then you would transfer the funds to the escrow agent. The escrow agent would hold the funds. And if the E-2 visa is approved, the escrow agent would transfer the funds to the seller. But if for any reason the E-2 visa is denied, the escrow agent would transfer the funds back to you. So the advantage of kind of, transferring the money through the escrow agent is really that if for any reason, the E-2 visa is denied, you would get the funds back. And again, kind of the only contingency left would have to be kind of the approval of the E-2 visa, and all the other contingencies to the transaction would already have to be met at the time you apply. So how long is the E-2 visa valid for? So this is so-called reciprocity period, and it's going to depend on your country of nationality. So nationals of certain countries, like for example, nationals of Jordan, can only get the E-2 visa issued for a period of 3 months. Then nationals of, for example, Canada or UK can get the E-2 visa issued for a period of 5 years. So again, it just kind of varies on your country of nationality. So you would just have to check the reciprocity period applicable to your country of nationality. The officers may limit the duration of the visa based on the strength of the case. So let's say, for example, that you are a national of Canada and the E-2 visa is normally issued for a period of 5 years. If for some reason the officer just has some concerns, like will this business be able to have employees, is this business going to be able to earn revenue? They always have the authority to issue the visa for a shorter period of time. So they could issue the visa, for example, for 2 years, and that way you would have to renew it in 2 years and present documents that indeed, the company is employing employees, the company is earning revenue. But in our experience, the officers don't do this that often. Like usually if they do approve the visa, they just approve it for the full reciprocity period. There is a difference between kind of the reciprocity period, which is the period the visa can be issued for, and then the amount of time you are admitted to the US on the E-2 visa. So every time you enter the US on the E-2 visa, you will be admitted for a period of 2 years. And so this is the same for all nationals. So for example, nationals of Jordan who get the E-2 visa approved only for a period of 3 months. When they enter the US on the E-2 visa, they are admitted for a period of 2 years. So this means that they can live and work in the US for the 2-year period. Now, let's say that they enter on the 3-month visa. They can live and work in the US for a period of 2 years. But if they leave the US and want to come back, they do need to have a valid visa to be able to come back to the country. So let's say that the 3-month visa already expired and they left the US and now they want to come back. They will have to apply for the E-2 visa again at a consulate abroad. Now, let's say that, for example, you are a Canadian national and you got the E-2 visa approved for a period of 5 years. It's going to be the same thing. Like, you will never be admitted to the US for the full period of 5 years. Every time you enter the US on the valid E-2 visa, you will be admitted for a period of 2 years. And so what this means is that before the 2-year period is up, you will just have to leave the US. You can just go back to Canada or like anywhere and re-enter. And as long as you have a valid visa in your passport, you will be given a new 2-year period of stay. Perfect. So let's discuss, how much investment is enough, and how much money do you have to invest to be able to get the E-2 visa. So you must invest a substantial amount of money. So what does substantial mean? So there is no definition in the regulations as to this is the minimum amount of money, and if you invest this amount of money, you meet the substantial requirements. So there is no such thing. The investment would generally have to be at least 50,000. And that would mean 50,000 spent on actual expenditures. So you would have to spend at least 50,000, and then you can have some additional money on the company's bank account as working capital. So let's say if you have additional $20,000 or $30,000, we could include it as part of the investment as working capital. But as I said, you should spend at least 50,000, and even the 50,000 would be considered kind of a low investment amount. So as I said, the money has to be spent on actual expenditures. So the government, they do want to see invoices issued or receipts. They will want to see, bank statements showing that you paid for the expenditures. And so how does the government, evaluate whether something is, whether the investment is substantial? So they used a so-called proportionality test. So they look at how much money you invested in the business, and then they look at what are the usual costs associated to establish, this type of business. And they kind of compare those two. And if they are the same or kind of approximate, then they would conclude that, that the investment was substantial. If you are buying a business, the government, generally you would just submit a purchase sale agreement and they would, generally they would not really want to see anything else than that. If you're buying a business from a family or kind of, a close friend, then it may be good to submit a fair market evaluation of the business, just to kind of show that, the purchase price you paid for the business is the fair market value of the business. Perfect. So now what are some strategies, to deal with a low investment amount, and how can you kind of increase your chance for approval if the investment amount is on the lower side? So you would, if the investment amount is on the lower side, meaning that you spend about $50,000 or so, you would want the other kind of parts of application to be as strong as possible. You would want to kind of emphasize if you have kind of previous experience in running this type of business in your home country, you would definitely want to emphasize that in the application, because that will show to the government that you have already established a similar type of business in your home country that has been successful, earning revenues, employing employees, and you are going to do the same thing in the US. If you are able to hire any employees before you apply for the E-2 visa, that's always going to be helpful for the application. And in that case, you should submit things like employment contracts with the employees or pay stubs, showing that the E-2 company is already employing US employees. And then sometimes it's just going to, just the type of business is going to help. So, for example, if you are purchasing a restaurant or you are starting a medical office, those are kind of businesses where it's kind of clear to the officer that you will have to hire employees to be able to operate that type of business. So just the type of business itself may help. Now, let's say, for example, that you are starting a consulting business. In that case, like the officer just may have kind of concerns, will you be able to really hire, like all these additional employees or contractors, or are you going to be the only one kind of providing the consulting services to the clients? If you're able to obtain letters of intent from clients or kind of get actual signed contracts from clients, that is definitely going to be helpful, and you should submit those with your application, because that's going to show that you already have clients interested in your services that want to kind of hire your company. If you are able to obtain a letter from the local chamber of commerce, that would just kind of confirm that they think it's going to be beneficial to have this type of business in this particular area, that may be helpful. You can also highlight any kind of ongoing company activity or sales. So if the company is already earning revenue, you would want to submit things like the company's profit and loss statement showing that, kind of confirming the revenue. If the business is a pure startup, you will want to submit a strong business plan with the application. So Kelly will go over kind of like what the business plan should contain later in the presentation. But the business plan, if you are starting a new business, is a really kind of important part of the application, because that's kind of the part of the application where you are explaining, like how you'll be able to, how many employees you will hire in the next 5 years, what are the financial projections of the company. You will want to submit a really strong business plan with the application. And as I said, if you are able to hire US employees before you apply, that's always going to be helpful. And sometimes it may be beneficial to get, especially if the investment amount is kind of really low, like really on the lower side, like let's say like 40,000 or 45 or something like that. In some cases, then it may be beneficial to get a letter from a certified public accountant who would basically review the expenditures you made, review the type of business, and who would just conclude that the CPA thinks that this type of this amount of investment is going to be sufficient for this type of business. Perfect. So now let's go over some common E-2 visa expenditures. So as I said in the beginning, like any money you pay for like website setup or hosting can be included. Any money you pay for computers, printers, scanners, iPads, or any other computer equipment can be included. If you are going to sell, products in the US, you can include any money you prepaid for inventory. Now the inventory, it's not a requirement that you have to purchase an inventory in the US. It's completely fine if you purchase it from, like a foreign country and ship it to the US. But I will say that some consulates, sometimes they want to see, like let's say that you invested $50,000, they do want to see that the majority of the expenditures were made in the US. So like let's say that, for example, you paid already 20,000 for the inventory and the inventory is being shipped from another country, then you would want to kind of purchase all the other things like computer equipment, furniture, and anything else you need in the US, because not all consulates, but some consulates kind of sometimes ask that question, like which country were the things purchased. Now, also you can include any furniture. Again, like furniture, you need to set up, your office, so that can be included. Any money you paid for like trademark or intellectual property can be included. If you already if you already have employees or contractors at the time you apply, then you can kind of include any money you paid to the employees or contractors as part of the E-2 visa investment. You can also include legal fees. So this can be, for example, the immigration legal fees, or if you have a business, if you're buying a business and you have a business attorney, any money you pay to the business attorney can be included. Then any money you pay for the lease can be included as well. And here, it's important that, basically any money you pay for the lease can be included. So like, let's say that you only pay for 1 month, like then you'll be only to be able to include that 1 month. But like, let's say that you prepay the lease for 12 months, then you will be able to include that whole amount as part of your E-2 visa investment. So that's kind of like one way. If you are starting, like a service-based oriented business and you don't really know like what else you should purchase to kind of increase the investment amount, prepaying like 6 months or 12 months for the lease may be helpful in that case. Then any money you pay for, like softwares or subscriptions or things like that can be included. And also any money you pay for like marketing, advertising, or office supplies can be included. Perfect. So now I will turn it over to Kelly and she will go over some strong versus weak E-2 visa expenditures.
Thank you, Michaela. So yes, there are some expenditures for the E-2 that are not good and should not be included, because even including them, even though your investment amount will be higher, it weakens the case, and because the officers may have a bad impression of the case based on using these weaker expenditures. So things like flights, car, like, fuel, Ubers, any hotel travel accommodations, meals, all of those things are not viewed favorably. Similarly, entertainment. There are even some consulates that in their FAQs say do not include these types of expenditures. So they do view them as very weak and really not necessary to kind of the setup of the business. Similarly, expenses paid to related parties. So let's say that you have a company in your home country that sets up websites, and you need your E-2 company to have a website. And so you pay the company that you own in your home country. They're not going to view that as, funds that are kind of irrevocably committed and at risk in the way you need for an E-2 visa, because they might just view it as money paid, to a related party. So that's not to say you can never, make an expenditure between related companies, especially if there's a very large group of companies. But it is something you want to be careful about and that you want to discuss with your attorney, so that the officer isn't looking at it and getting the impression that you didn't really commit money, and, irrevocably commit it in a way where it could actually be lost. All right, so let's talk about some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses. So theoretically, very low investment is needed to start a consulting business. It's very common for people to call us and say, I would love to get an E-2 visa, but I just don't have anything I can spend money on. I own a computer, I have my network, I have my knowledge. That's really all I need. I don't need to spend any money. And so while as an entrepreneur, obviously you want to start up your business, being as frugal as possible and not spending money necessarily. Ultimately, to get the E-2 visa, this is an investor visa. You do have to show that you have invested an amount that is high enough that the officer believes you are committed to operating the enterprise. So the concern here is they don't want you to just put money into a business bank account that is not committed to anything, and then you are granted a 5-year visa, and then there's no real assurance that they have that you'll actually follow through with your business plan. So they do want to see that you've actually spent money, and that you're committed to this particular business. So things that can be helpful. One is going to be getting articles, market research, industry reports that show how much it costs to get this type of business up and running and explain you've spent more than that. And when we talk about spending money for a consulting company, we don't want people to waste money. But what we want you to do is to try to think about spending money in areas that you would spend money down the line. So, as Michaela mentioned previously, prepaying for office space can be helpful. Equipment. So, let's say, in your business plan, you're going to have 3 or 4 employees in the first 2 years of operations. Maybe you purchase computers and phones and equipment for them that perhaps you would have waited to purchase, but you purchase it now because it's helpful for your investment. Similarly, marketing. You may be fine kind of starting with no website or a very bare bones website or not much of a marketing spend, but instead you actually, bring that cost forward and you get a really, well-developed website, or you do start running Google Ads or things like that earlier than you normally would, again, because it's helpful for the business. You would have spent that money down the road anyway, and it helps, to get your E-2 visa. Similarly, hiring employees. While it's not required to hire employees before you file for your E-2 visa, it is very favorable for your application. Um, and any money that you spend, so if you hire an administrative assistant and you pay them for a few weeks, or you have to spend money to get, insurance, or you have to pay a payroll provider, all of that are very strong E2 expenditures that can help raise the amount that you're committing to the business. It's also good to spend over a large number of categories. So it doesn't really work to say, well, I'll just spend $30,000 to set up a website, and then I will, that will be my main spend. And then I'll get some, pens and a printer, and I'll have, $100 in office expenses. That type of lopsided spending is not generally viewed very favorably. What they want to see is that you've spent money in realistic categories that any type of business would really need to get up and running. Again, like, you may not need to buy a laptop for yourself because maybe you have one already. Sometimes if you bought that recently, you can use, if you have a source of funds for it, you can, use that receipt and that proof of payment, and attribute that to your business. Or you could also buy a new one, again, for your employees that you're going to hire in the next couple of years. Let's talk about real estate investments. Real estate is quite a risky area when you are applying for an E-2. We have successfully done many E-2s in real estate, but there are some special considerations. So one is that when you're pursuing a real estate company for the E-2, you just know in advance that the officers are going to view it with a lot of scrutiny. So there's a big concern that officers will have, that somebody is just purchasing a property and putting it in an LLC, and then they're just going to collect passive real estate income, right? Or maybe they have a couple properties on Airbnb. So you do need to, particularly if you're doing some type of property management company, or you do have that kind of arrangement, you really need to make sure that you have a solid business plan that shows how the company is going to earn revenue, earn enough money to hire employees, and actually be a real and operating business. You'll also need to show that you have the proper licenses to run the business. So real estate is a very heavily regulated industry, very regulated by state. So depending on where you're setting up and what type of business you're starting, you really want to make sure you've researched that. So for example, we have clients who've done a real estate brokerage firm, a property management company, renovation or construction, house flipping. Especially for kind of a brokerage firm, and any type of construction. Usually there are some licenses that are required. You want to think about, if it's a brokerage, are you able to get that license in advance? Or if not, can you partner with somebody or partner with a company who has that license, so that you can show there's a realistic runway for you to get the visa, start offering services, and then get the licenses you need. So you do want to take that into account because that is something they will ask about. All right, equity trading companies. These have a lot of the same concerns and considerations as real estate companies. The concern is, are you going to, actually be running a real and operating business that is large enough to employ people, or are you kind of doing, trading for yourself, or for maybe a few friends and family? You need to show that there's going to be enough volume that you're going to be able to hire workers in the United States. It's also highly regulated, similar to real estate. So you want to show you're going to have the proper licenses, you're going to have the proper corporate structure, depending on what type of trading you're doing. And you'll have to convince the officer, again, that this is not just passive, and kind of minimal in terms of the amount of revenue that it will generate, and that it will generate more than just money for you, and your family. All right, let's talk about some common reasons for E-2 denials. One is low investment amount. So we've talked today about a lot of strategies, to try to strengthen a case, when you have a lower investment amount, but there are some investment amounts that are just too low. A case comes to mind where a client had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. Even if arguably somebody could start a business with that little investment, it's just not going to work. The investment amount is much too low to show that the person is really committed to actually operating the enterprise. So the good news is, if you do have working capital and the ability and willingness to spend that on startup expenditures, a low investment amount often can be rectified, and you can reapply and get the visa. This client that came to mind, came to us after the denial. We advised him on spending more money. He ended up spending around 50,000 and went back to the consulate and was approved with 50,000 spent and 50,000 in working capital. Other reasons could be nature of the business. We've just discussed there are some riskier types of businesses, consulting companies, real estate, equity trading companies. Sometimes, officers may be concerned about these types of businesses, and you'll need to do more to show that these can be viable E-2 businesses. Also, obviously, anything that, they could be confused about, anything related to kind of hemp, or that might, trigger concerns about, kind of controlled substances would be, very problematic. Um, Filing location and venue. So, not every consulate is the same in terms of how they view investment amount. There are some consulates that are very used to seeing, single business owners, or small dollar value amounts or investments around $100,000 or less. And there are some consulates that are much more used to seeing large multinational companies that are sending over hundreds of employees. So for those consulates, they may be less friendly to the small business owner because they're used to seeing investments of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. So you do want to take that into account. Trends do change over the years. Consular officers will kind of shift. Politics will shift, and the way that they interpret the law, can change. And because there's not any kind of fixed amount in the regulations, the way that they will interpret what is substantial will change over time. So the next two are kind of related. So, a similar business in your home country without employees, and concern, over whether the business is going to create jobs. So these both speak to the marginality requirement, showing that the business is going to support more than just the investor and their family. So if you've been running a consulting company in your home country for 10 years and you never hired anybody, they may not believe you, even if you have a very robust business plan showing you're going to hire people. So in that instance, it may be beneficial for you to actually hire somebody before you go ahead with your application. So you do want to make sure that you're taking that into account, because it is very important that you show the business will hire workers. Sometimes you can have issues with the adjudicating officer. Consular officers are human beings. They're getting through often, dozens, if not hundreds, of visa applications a day. There are officers at kind of all levels of training, and the E-2 visa is one of the more complex visas. So not every officer is trained on it. So if you do feel that you had an issue with the officer where they were either not, as aware of the law, or perhaps, their demeanor was rude. You try to remember, they have full discretion over whether to grant the visa or not. You want to be as polite as possible. Ask them what they were unhappy with. And if you really feel like, they were really off base or wrong, you can always try to reapply. Most consulates will try to give you a different officer. It's not guaranteed, but they do try it. And similarly, if you really felt like there was a major legal issue, there are some avenues that you can take. It's not possible to kind of appeal a visa denial, but there are certain avenues that you can use for consular liaison if you really feel like it's a complete misapplication of the law. Another reason might be, oh, sorry, that last one might just be not meeting the requirements at the time of filing. So, if you submitted and you did, and the company is not 50% owned by treaty country nationals, or no money has been invested, these types of things, sometimes people will file and believe they have covered each of the requirements, but may not have an understanding. In those cases, you would go back, revisit the application and try to reapply. Let's talk about some adjudication trends. So approval rates, the government does post approval rates. They're posted between 80 to 90%. Our firm's approval rate is about 98%, although of course past results don't predict future outcome, and no firm can ever guarantee a visa approval. That's not something any law firm can guarantee. In terms of timelines, for London right now, they publicly report a review time of 60 working days. We're seeing that it's actually, really much longer than that, closer to maybe 80 or 90 working days, or even perhaps a little bit longer. They do seem to have a very large amount of E-2 cases pending right now, and so it is taking quite a while. Once they review the case, they'll send you an email and let you know that you can schedule your interview. And then most people are able to schedule the interview within about a month. Again, though, those timelines can change. They sometimes get very busy, for example, over the summer when they're issuing a lot of student visas, or also over the holidays when there's a lot of, staff that have taken off. In Toronto, they're reviewing cases in about 15 to 20 business days or less. And then you can schedule an interview, again, usually about a month, although that can change. Generally, timelines, really do vary at consulates. We finally have, there were the delays that were caused by the pandemic have kind of gone by the wayside. Most consulates have returned, to kind of pre-pandemic processing levels, but there are some that have not really caught up yet, and where processing times could be months, even up to and over a year. So you do want to take that into account when you're making your plans. We do also anticipate that potentially there will be, delays as there are changes to the Department of State and staffing later this year. Um, USCIS versus a consular filing, there's some very important differences here. If you're in the United States in a valid status like B1 or B2, you can potentially change your status to E2 instead of going to a consulate. The benefit with that is you don't have to leave the United States. You can file all your paperwork from within the United States. You can also pay for premium processing to get an answer within 15 business days. That would be an approval, a denial, or a request for more evidence. If it's a request for evidence, you would submit your evidence, and then they'll usually issue a final decision 15 business days after that. The downside is that what you get is a 2-year approval. You do not get a visa that allows you to travel internationally. Another potential downside is that USCIS really focuses a lot on the source and trail of funds. So if you have a very complex source and trail of funds where you've gotten money from multiple sources and it's hard to document it, a USCIS filing would be quite difficult. If you file at a consulate, then a benefit is that you will actually get a visa stamp in your passport that allows you to travel internationally. Many people, many nationalities can get a visa stamp for multiple years. For example, the UK, Australia, Canadians, all of them can get 5-year visas. Each time you enter on the E-2, you get 2 years in E-2 status. And then that just means you need to travel internationally before the 2 years are up, and you can come back, on your valid visa. So, the other, benefit of a consulate is they often take a more holistic view of the source of funds as opposed to USCIS, where they kind of do an audit trail of exactly where every dollar went. Um, so there can be some benefits to the consulate, and that there are also some benefits to USCIS. It's definitely something to discuss with your attorney to see what's right for you. Um, You also want to think about, specific considerations based on the consular post where you're applying. So there are consular instructions that are specific to each post. There are consular preferences, as I discussed on the previous slide. There are some consulates that are used to seeing multinational companies and some that are more familiar with small business owners. So you can't always pick and choose any consulate, but you may have options, and it's a good thing to discuss with your attorney to see what those options might be. Another thing to remember is that there are certain posts that ask for a CPA certification of your business plan. They want a CPA to sign off on the business plan and on the numbers. We do also have a CPA on staff, so to the extent we draft the business plan, that is something we're able to do as well. Let's talk about some issues and complex areas for E2s. One common question, do you have to hire employees before you apply? The answer is no. That's not required anywhere in the law. That being said, there are times when it can be very favorable and strong for your application to do so. So if it is an option for you or something you feel comfortable doing, it does strengthen the petition significantly. There's also certain consulates where, despite what the law says, they insist that you need employees to meet that marginality requirement. Those tend to be consulates that are the ones that are seeing those multinational companies. So they're not as familiar with kind of E2s in the startup, environment. Complicated source and trail of funds. So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, if you're applying with USCIS and you have a complex source and trail of funds, it can be very difficult because they do want to see every single piece of evidence that documents where the money went. So, for example, if you are investing money that are your savings from employment, many consulates will accept your tax returns and proof of you transferring a lump sum of money. With USCIS, they would actually want to see the tax returns, proof of your payroll, hitting your bank account and being maintained there. So if you were transferring it to your savings, you would have to show that transfer. If you, earned $5,000 in a month, but then you spent $5,000 in that month, they're not going to view that as you maintaining the salary. So it can get much more complicated documenting the source and trail of funds with USCIS. Um, Loans and gifts are permitted as a source of funds for the E2 with some important caveats. So for loans, these can be kind of unsecured loans or secured on your personal property. For example, if you own a home, you take out a home equity loan. Um, that could work. What does not work is a loan that is secured by the assets of the E2 business. So, for example, this comes up a lot in seller financing situations. So, if you are purchasing a business and there's, 50% of it is seller financing with the security being the business, that's not going to work well in an E2, case because it's going to be hard to show that you've invested a substantial amount if you've only invested 50%. For gifts, these are permitted. However, the gift giver needs to feel comfortable showing you where they got the money and providing their financial documents. So if somebody says, yes, I'll give you a gift, I'll write a gift letter, but I'm not willing to provide my tax returns or I'm not willing to provide the proof of where I got the money, that doesn't work for the E2. You will need a gift giver who is willing to provide that documentation. Um, E2s for two investors. So can you have ownership of 50-50? And the answer is yes. If you both want to be investors, you each need to own it 50-50. If you're the same nationality and you want to own it a different percentage, you could potentially look at doing an investor and employee application. Substantive changes to the business after filing. If there are any changes in ownership, you want to make sure that if you're the investor, that the amount that you own doesn't drop below 50%. If you're an employee, you want to make sure that, that the company continues to be owned at least 50% by treaty country nationals. Even if you have a 5-year visa and you own the company 50%, if after a year you sell 10% of the company to a US citizen business partner and now you only own 40%, this is a problem. This is a violation of your status, and technically the company is no longer an E2 company and you're not maintaining your status anymore. So sometimes people have the impression that because they have an approved 5-year visa, any changes during that time don't matter. But that's not correct. You do need to maintain ownership of the company. Let's say that you own 50%, of the company, but now you own 60%. That's fine because the company is still meeting that E2 requirement for ownership. But if your ownership drops, that can be problematic. Similarly, if there's a major change to the type of the business, that needs to be approved before you can start with that change. So if you were running a wedding photography company and now you want to close that down and open a restaurant, you need to go back to the consulate or to USCIS and get that approval first. Family business purchases, these are also heavily scrutinized. Most of the time, if you're purchasing a business, the law says that kind of the fair market value of the business, is going to be considered substantial. But if you're purchasing from a family member, they're going to want maybe more proof that this is actually the fair market value. So it's a good idea to get a valuation or something like that. Um, the impact of the new administration. So, Buy American, Hire American is an executive order that came out during the administration prior. And this was something where the focus is on hiring Americans, making an impact in America. This is to say that for E2s, we do recommend that you spend the money in the United States. It's not a requirement. Like, let's say you have a bunch of inventory from your home country, that can certainly be a valid E2 expense, but for other expenditures, it's a good idea to try to get vendors in the US. We anticipate that we may see trends of asking for higher investment, possibly higher employee numbers, really focusing on what is the economic benefit to the US. Approval rates really didn't change much from 2016 to 2020. We have not seen an impact on, approval rates at this point. That being said, again, we do anticipate perhaps some slowdowns in processing, particularly at consulates if there's major staffing changes made to the Department of State. All right, so let's see if we have any questions that have come in. Someone here has said, can I open a business with 150 US dollars, all from a loan? I'm going to assume this is 150,000 US dollars. Can you potentially open a business? Possibly. It's going to depend on the type of business. Loans are permitted, as I discussed previously, secured and unsecured, as long as the security is your personal property. Can I flip properties for an E2? Can I use contractors or do I need to employ tradesmen? I have cash to buy the first property. So house flipping is a very risky type of E2 case unless you're doing it on a very large scale. So to give you an example, we had a client who was flipping 30 to 40 properties. If you are hiring subcontractors in your industry and you're paying hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to those subcontractors, you may be able to primarily employ subcontractors as opposed to direct W-2 employees, but it's always stronger to have at least a few W-2 employees for your company. And in most, the construction is kind of a different industry with that, but for most people, you will need that those W-2 employees. If we have to return post the E2 visa expiry, do you mean we have to sell the business and go? I'm not sure what this question is asking. Yeah, I'm not sure what this question is asking. Perhaps maybe send in another question. Um, can I move freely for holidays and see family in the UK every few months? If you get an E2 visa stamp in your passport, then yes, you can do that. If you got a change of status from within the United States, then no, that doesn't give you the ability to travel. But once you left, you'd have to go to a consulate, submit a brand new application. They'll review it as a brand new application. And if that's approved, then you can go ahead and, travel internationally. Michaela, do you want to handle this one? Where do you recommend I look for a ready-made business? Will a franchise qualify?
Yeah, so franchise can definitely qualify and is a good option for an E2. You may reach out to like a local business consultant in the state or kind of city area where you would want to buy the business. So that would be the best avenue.
Perfect. Is it possible to run a laundromat or convenience store while operating a consulting firm on the side with both businesses being managed under a holding company? So there's a couple options here. You can have kind of one corporation that holds, not separate ones that kind of has the laundromat and convenience store and consulting. That's, I'd say, the one that is the simplest in this from an immigration perspective, in the sense that the E2 is entity specific. And so, it can be complicated if you just have a holding company. and you're setting up multiple subsidiaries, and those are the ones with all the revenue and the operations and the employees, it's a little bit of a riskier structure and a riskier case. If it's possible to set everything up under one entity, that's often kind of better for the E2. You also can potentially have a holding company or kind of an overall management company where you provide management services through a business to business agreement and then receive, revenue for kind of that management service offering. So there's a few different ways to structure it, but it's a bit more complicated and something that, you'd want to discuss with your attorney. Um, Michaela, would you like to handle this? I'm currently in the US. I'd like to change my status. I only have about 40 to 50K. Would you say that's problematic? I'm thinking about buying a franchise. Also, do we help with the business purchase?
Yeah, so as I said, franchises are a good option for an E2. About the investment amount, so 40, 50,000. So actually, for USCIS, like change of status filings, they're usually they usually accept, and we have had a lot of approvals where the investment amount was around like 40,000 or even like a little bit lower than that. So I would say that for a USCIS change of status filing, that investment amount may be okay, depending on the type of business. And then, does your firm help with the business purchase? So, yeah, the business purchase is kind of state specific. So you would have to find unless you're in New York, you would have to find a counsel in that particular state.
Perfect. So someone's asked, what are the best business categories under 50,000 to apply? I would say, feel free to set up a consultation if you want to talk through those options. Generally, service-based businesses that don't have a lot of equipment requirements are going to be ones where there is a better argument that you can invest that amount and still, kind of have spent everything necessary to get the business up and running. Um, Somebody's asked for a construction company, you need a license, and the license is issued if the director has a work visa. Therefore, the company works through subcontractors, and the director applies for a visa for independent construction. So, for very specific inquiries like this, I would suggest setting up a consultation, to discuss those because that's going to be kind of very specific to the situation. What is the future post the E-2 visa expiry? What happens next? So E-2 visas can be renewed indefinitely for as long as the business is continuing to operate. So, that's kind of one thing to keep in mind. If you're going to continue operating the business in perpetuity, you can kind of continue doing that. If the question is about can you transition to a green card, there is no kind of direct path in U.S. immigration law where you automatically get a green card after being here on a temporary status for some length of time. But if you're here and you do qualify for a green card, you can try to apply for one. E2 clients of ours sometimes get green cards through various methods, including the EB5, investment green card, the EB2 national interest waiver. Sometimes they're sponsored by U.S. companies through the PERM process. So I'd encourage you to set up a consultation to discuss if you'd like. We also do webinars on this particular issue of green cards. If the E-2 visa is in the passport, does the person need to visit a consulate every time to re-enter the US, or is it automatically allowed while the visa is valid? So when you have a valid visa, you use that to enter the US. So as long as it's a multiple entry visa and it's still valid, you can continue to use it. You don't have to go back to the consulate. Very limited situations where you might have to go back each time you travel are, for example, if you are getting a 3-month, certain nationalities, so Bangladesh and Egypt, they get visas granted for 3 months, single entry visas. So if you use that visa to enter, you'll get 2 years on E2 status, but when you leave, you'd have to go back and get a new visa. So we've answered the questions. So Michaela, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Thank you everyone for your participation and your great questions. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.